Welcome to this session on the Sister Renal Centers Program and the Sister Transplant Center Program. My name is Peter Kerr. I'm from Monash in Melbourne, Australia, and I chair the Sister Renal Center Program. Also online is Philip O'Connell, who's from Sydney in Australia. Phil's from the Transplant Society, who co-sponsor the Transplant Sister Center Program. So we're going to talk you through some of the aspects of Sister Renal Centers and what's involved and what we'd like to see in applications. So this is meant to be an instructive session for people who are considering applying or also for those upgrading in the program of Sister Renal Centers. Now, that's interesting. I'm trying to advance. There we go. So there we are, and Sophie is online as well as other staff from the ISN, including Mara. Sophie's is part of the glue that holds all this together. Okay, so here's our agenda. We're going to talk about a description of the programs, the opportunities involved, and in particular as well, how to prepare a successful application. And Sophie in particular will talk through the technicalities of using the website. So just to clarify some of the terms we'll use, in the Sister Renal Centre program, we have pairings between emerging centres and supporting centres. So the emerging centres are centres from a low or middle income country who need training. So basically, they're asking for our assistance for training, and they are usually supported then by an experienced training centre from a higher income country, so that the expertise, if you like, and the support is provided from the high income country to the lower middle income country. We also have a concept called trios. This is when the emerging centre has graduated through this program and then adopts a position where they act as the mentor for a local new emerging centre, still with support though from the original supporting centre, so that it has strengths in terms of local input, but also has that backbone of support from the original supporting centre. Well, you also see the term SRC for Sister Renal Centres and STC for the Sister Transplant Centres. The programs are meant to link emerging centres in emerging countries with supporting centres of excellence in the developed world. These partnerships are then meant to provide a system of funding and a framework for the interactions, providing educational benefits and long-term follow-up. Our ultimate goal, of course, is to create centres of excellence to support and enhance nephrology within geographical regions. And we hope also that these partnerships form long-standing relationships between the centres. Of course, there's a specific Sister Transplant Centre program now. Many of the applications for Sister Renal Centres have a focus on transplantation, and we've been very fortunate that the Transplant Society has joined forces with us to support transplant-focused Sister Renal Centres. That's not to say that, if you like, ordinary Sister Renal Centres can't be involved in transplantation, but particularly the ones who have a strong focus on transplantation, we're tending to direct down the STC pathway. I don't know whether Phil wants to add anything extra at that point.
Just to say that I suppose the big difference in a transplant focused application compared to a nephrology-based application is that the multidisciplinary team for the transplant program is slightly different in that you often need a big input from surgeons, pathologists, tissue typing, and there's more aspects for support outside the normal focus of nephrology within that program, and supporting those extra renal but important aspects of a transplant program would be viewed favourably in a Transplant Sister Centre Program application.
Yep, that's a great point. Thank you. That's great. So how does it work? So when pairings start, they start at level C, which has only got a very small budget of $1,500 per year. And then, assuming they're making reasonable progress, they can progress along to level B and level A. So you can see from the slide that at level B, the budget is $12,000 per year, and at level A, it goes up to $15,000. And of course, then, as we mentioned, there's the option of developing a trio and starting again in the program later on. The program overall is quite competitive. Excuse me. So only the most promising and sustainable partnerships really get a chance to advance to the next levels in particular. So the upgrading to level B or A includes progress report requirements, and we are very keen now to set objectives and measurable targets, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go along. And so the reports obviously need to relate to those original targets and talk about what activities have occurred, how the money's been spent, and with both of those in relation to the original targets. The amount of dollars over the 6-year period adds up to $57,000, so it's not insignificant, but obviously it has its limitations. This slide gives an idea of what's happening currently in the program. You'll see the level C, B and A pairings represented here, with the split between the transplant centres and Sister Renal Centers evident there. So the blue ones are the Sister Renal Centers and the orange ones are Sister Transplant Centers. You'll see from the text on the side that there's 70 active Sister Centers at the moment, 15 transplant-focused ones. So the total budget is quite large, $572,000 in 2019. So there's a big commitment from ISN and with the help of TTS to provide support to this program. Over the last 10 years, there's been 36 pairs and trios graduated, and we've heard reports of those in the past and at the World Congresses, and they're quite rewarding circumstances that most of them have experienced. And since the STC, the transplant centres have joined, there's just been 2 graduates last year for the first time. So the benefits, apart from the dollars that we mentioned, the grants totaling $57,000 over the 6 years, also include ISN journal subscriptions to the emerging centres, including Kidney International supplements, and the Kidney International reports. As you probably know, that Kidney International has expanded considerably over recent years. There's also provision of 5 passes for the ISN Academy, and in addition, if you're applying to other ISN programs, there's a bonus scoring system if you're already in an existing program such as Sister Renal Centre. So for instance, if you have a Sister Renal Centre program and someone from the emerging centre was perhaps applying for a fellowship, there's a bonus points awarded in the scoring system. There's also priority for travel grants to World Congress and ISN Frontiers, so both of those ISN meetings. And of course, the World Congress now is an annual event, with the next one being in Abu Dhabi in March 2020. At the graduation end of the program, the better pairings are eligible to compete for the ISN Schreier Award, which is an award in the name of Robert Schreier, a prominent member of the ISN in the past, to the best graduating partnership. We do have a note of caution around some of the benefits. The financial support provided by the Sister Renal Centre programs are intended to provide a framework amongst the centres and to reinforce goodwill and interaction between the centres. They're not intended to form the sole basis of what should ideally be a long-lasting and fruitful collaboration among the centres. They're meant to be a stimulus for that, but they're unlikely to ever be the sole basis for it. The other thing is that the funds are meant to be used for educational activities. And in that respect, we ask pairings to submit plans before the budget is released, and we need a report on how it's being used. It's important perhaps to think of some of the past partnerships that have been very successful, just to get an idea of the types of activities that are entertained for the sister centres. There's a couple on this slide. The first one in particular has been a very successful collaboration between the Queen Elizabeth Central Hospital in Malawi and where is it?
It was a link to the UK.
Yeah, it was the UK. It was Sheffield, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, one of those centres in the UK, and they effectively set up an entire nephrology service in Malawi. There was almost nothing there to start with, and that's been an amazingly successful program with UK help to Malawi. Some of the other ones we've seen reported on recently include the first paediatric kidney transplant done in Yangon in Myanmar with the help of the Singaporean group, and I can attest to a very nice video presentation of the deceased donation program for transplantation set up in Guatemala with assistance from the US. So they're excellent examples of quite significant success. Further on the slide, a low body weight transplantation, so it's in pediatric transplantation in particular in India. And in fact, the list goes on and on. I think from memory, the presentations for some of the successful Sister Renal Centers is also available from the World Congress in Melbourne, for instance, online.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to how we prepare a successful application and what constitutes an appropriate sort of application. So first of all, the emerging centre must be from a low or middle income country, and that the ISN for that purpose uses the World Bank listing. For the Sister Renal Centre program, both centres need to have at least one ISN full member, and the liaison officer that we have as our point of contact of each centre should be an ISN member. For the STC program, obviously with the involvement of the Transplant Society over and above ISN, we've said that both centres should have at least one member of either the ISN or TTS. I mean, obviously it would be preferable for both, but we understand that there may be limitations on that. In the application file, and Sophie will run through the actual process shortly, there's a description of the needs and objectives required. And as we've talked about, we really like to see some sort of measurable outcome. We want some detail in the action plan with some specifics if possible. But I think it's worth saying that we're not slaves to these proposals. If circumstances change, we prefer to be told about them and to consider those changes, but it's rare that we would say, okay, we're going to withhold funding. It's most usually we would say, okay, we understand that circumstances have changed. We understand you've got some new targets and new thoughts, and we're happy if you run with them. So we're not overly strict on that, although we still like to consider any changes before we approve budget. It's important to realise again, and I reinforce that the monies are intended for educational activities. So we unfortunately cannot provide support for equipment, and we certainly are not prepared to provide support for salaries. Consumables in a similar way, for instance, dialysis consumables are out of scope for this sort of program. It would consume too much of the budget too quickly. We do also state that no more than 10% of the allocated budget can be used to attend nephrology conferences and events such as the World Congress or the American Meeting. Having said that, if seminars and conferences are organised in the developing country, it is feasible to use some monies towards those sorts of activities. So probably the most common use of the monies is for visits. So visits between the centres, and these can be in either direction. So these could be from the supporting centre to the developing centre, with visits of senior clinicians, usually providing expertise, teaching, bedside teaching, instruction, and assistance with any number of different activities. Sometimes it's setting up protocol type things rather than other activities. Sometimes it may be hands-on teaching, for instance, inserting Tenkoffs. So those sorts of visits are very useful, and similarly, visits from the emerging centre to the supporting centre can obviously be very worthwhile as well. One minor difficulty there sometimes is that in many of the developed countries, it may be difficult to get hands-on experience because of legislation in many of the countries preventing visiting doctors from doing hands-on management. But also all sorts of other projects can be included in the proposals, things like running local and regional CMEs, continuing medical education programs, providing educational materials for the emerging centre, attendance at training courses. Establishment of programs is quite a common one. So setting up aims to, for instance, establish peritoneal dialysis or establish transplantation or establish acute renal failure management, establishing nephropathology, which is obviously very important support for many nephrology programs. Community orientation is obviously another aspect that comes up quite frequently, almost like World Kidney Day on steroids. Extending World Kidney Day to other activities can be quite useful. Some limited clinical research activities can be supported, although again, research on the whole is somewhat out of scope for the program. Other activities that relay knowledge to regional, national, and international meetings and publications can be included. And World Kidney Day specifically is considered a useful use of money as well. It's worth also pointing out that we do prefer, where possible, to have partnerships that are close geographically, so that we can have intra-regional partnerships. This obviously has benefits in terms of costs to the program, in terms of people visiting from either direction, but often it also means that culture and language is more similar, and it's a lot easier for people to understand the needs of the emerging country in terms of the cultural differences and language differences, and if you like, medical culture as well, in terms of how things are done. So that wherever possible, intra-regional support is preferred. And an example might be in my own area, in the OSEA region, Australia supporting Southeast Asian countries makes some sense because of the proximity. but even within those countries, in the region, there are countries that speak the same or similar language, such as Malaysia and Indonesia, and Malaysia could support Indonesia because of the language similarities. Or Thailand and Laos would be another example where the language is similar enough and the culture is similar enough to have significant benefits. They're just simple examples and by no means should be considered what we absolutely want. There are partnerships in existence with the ISN. So we've talked today a bit about the Transplant Society being in partnership, but also several other societies co-badge some of these Sister Renal Centers and Sister Transplant Centers, such as the Asian Pacific Society of Nephrology and the Australian and New Zealand Society, as well as the Indian Society of Nephrology, and they support sister centres in their region with additional funding so that we can expand the program. They usually share 50-50 in the costs of the program, and will support particular activities in their region. There are also a number of regional training centres established by ISN. These are centres that, if you like, have well-experienced centres. They've been involved in various ISN activities, both in terms of sister renal centres and other training applications, running CMEs and the like. There's a list of them on the slide. I won't go through them all, but these centres, if you like, well-experienced supporting centres that have the possibility of taking on more than one partner, so that they may be options for some applicants who are looking for a supporting centre. Did you want to say anything more about that, Sophie, or?
No, it's okay. You can continue on that. It's good.
Okay, cool. So the evaluation criteria, we want to see on the application form some details around what the specific needs of the emerging centre are and how those needs might be met by the supporting centre and how the circumstances can be improved. We obviously like to see the pairings, the emerging centre and the supporting centre being prepared to work collaboratively, and we obviously want to see benefit to the community at large rather than just benefit to a couple of individuals. So we're very keen to see that our activities are going to be of more benefit than just to one or two individual people. We of course want details in the application too about the planned visits and projects, and sometimes we understand that planning a year in advance or something may not be absolutely strictly adhered to, and things come up and things happen, but we'd like to see some idea of a plan. We're particularly keen to see involvement in other ISN programs, so that if centres have already had ISN involvement, it's nice to include that in the application. And as we've talked about briefly, we also like to consider the geographical distance between the centres. It's probably fair to say that because of the competitive nature of the program and how it's become more competitive over time with more applications, that we're unlikely to support applications from well-developed centres in developing countries. There are examples, for instance, in some parts of the world that they've made enormous steps forward in recent years, but even in many of those countries, there's well-developed and less well-developed centres. So coming from, I'll use the example, but please don't take offence to this in any way, but within India, there's some very well-developed centres, and just because they're from India doesn't mean we're going to support them. Some of those hospitals in India have much better facilities than my hospital. So we need to consider that, and it's not because we don't really want to support them, it's just that we don't have the capacity to support everyone, and so we need to make decisions around who we can and can't support. We talked a little bit before about the measurables, the types of things that we that might be considered, and these are just examples and simple examples. If the objective is to establish a transplant unit, then a measurable obviously will be the number of transplants performed, or it may be establishing a deceased donor program, and again the number of deceased donors that have been realised. It might be establishing a peritoneal dialysis program, and so you could report on the number of PD patients that are established, and then you could also talk about things such as the peritonitis rate in that. If it was establishing an AKI program, it may simply be the number of patients with AKI that have been treated with dialysis and recovered. So those are simple examples. We're not after really high-level outcomes. We want simple, clinical, straightforward outcomes that are easy to measure. We don't expect enormous bookkeeping or anything like that. These should be fairly easy to collect the data, easy to maintain, and obviously of benefit to the centre in the long term in establishing local support for their programs. Again, remembering that the Sister Renal Centre programs are there to get things going. They're not going to support activities forever. And so centres, as they become established, will obviously be in a circumstance where they may be looking for funding locally and regionally. And so having that sort of data is going to be useful for them as well as for us to assess progress. The types of mistakes we see on applications, and by mistakes I mean the things that we would see that would say we can't make a decision about funding this project because we don't have enough information most commonly, and the types of things. An expert from America is going to visit and update our nephrology. Now that's a very vague statement that really doesn't tell us much. Whereas if you said Dr. Y is coming, he's an expert on PD and he's going to help establish our PD program by identifying appropriate patients, teaching catheter insertion, and establishing a peritonitis treatment regimen, and even a registry of our PD patients. That sort of data is enough to make us feel like the activity is going to be worthwhile. In terms of using the budget, be realistic. I mean, obviously at level C, there's not much money to spend, and it's mostly about level C is mostly about establishing the links between the groups and building on those links. And then level B and level A is where you can get particularly involved in more activities. Now, obviously, if there are ways of covering greater activities at level C from local monies, with ISN money just being supportive, we're not going to object to that. We're going to be very happy about that. Again, supplementing the monies with local support is obviously important, and even in terms of visits, we like to think that whilst the sister program will cover, for instance, airfares, the local ground costs, such as hotel and meals, are covered by local sources. That's to try and make our money stretch further. And I just remind people again that we're not going to cover equipment, capital costs, salaries, and consumable costs. It's not in scope, unfortunately. We just don't have enough money to extend to that. So just to remind you that the primary role of the program is education. It's not primarily to support research. And again, I mentioned earlier that some basic clinical research may be supported, such as epidemiology, data collection. But laboratory research in particular will not be supported. Unfortunately, again, it's really a limitation of monies. There are other programs available that can be applied to for that type of thing. So this is the timeline. So the application process will open shortly, and with a deadline of 1st of October. And then we get to work and do the scoring and review the scoring, and you'll see that by February we have, by January we inform the successful pairs, and then I will remind you that there is a grant agreement that has to be signed, and we've had trouble getting signed agreements back from people, and we're not, unfortunately, unable to provide any money until we get signed agreements. And it's surprising how many people apply for programs, get granted success in the program, and then don't do the paperwork and never get any money. Unfortunately, that's not uncommon. So we will remind you to pay attention to that, and pay attention to your inbox and your spam box, maybe. I think, okay, so this is the reminder of 1st October. This, I think, is where Sophie takes over.
Yes, Peter, this is Mara. Before passing on to Sophie, first of all, thank you, Peter and Philip. I would just like to remind our audience that they are all muted at this point, but they can ask their questions by going to the question box and just typing the questions. We will have time to address all those questions by the end of the presentation. Okay, thank you. I will now pass to Sophie.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Mara. Can you all see, I suppose we can all see the screen that is there. So my role is actually to take you through, or at least to give you a quick flavor of the online application forms. So as Peter mentioned, there are two different programs. One is the SRC, so Sister Renal Center Program, which is hosted by the ISN, and the other is a joint ISN and TTS Sister Transplant Center Program focusing on transplantation mostly. You can reach so they are hosted on two different sites, and you can reach those sites by going on the ISN website. If you navigate the menu, you go in programs, and then you will find a Sister Center Program, so Sister Renal Centers and Sister Transplant Center Programs. And also worth to mention that the Sister Transplant Center Program forms are also available with the link from the TTS website. Okay, so this is once you click on the link to access the forms, you get to a home page, and on this home page you can either sign in if you already have an account, or you need to create an account. Note that you can only reach to the forms if you have an account created. So the next slide shows you that basically you just have to fill in some very basic contact details, create a password, and then you are going to receive an email with a link on which you're going to click to validate your account. And afterwards, once you log in again on the platform, you can create an application, and then you can reach your application at any time by clicking on edit. And this is the most interesting screen, because basically it provides you with an overview of all the different steps that you need to take to submit your application. So in blue, you can see all the things that you need to do or to complete. And then you have this action column. You would click on start to get started. On the on the right-hand screen, you have the progress bar, which shows you how much progress you have done on your application. And obviously, you have to fill in all the different steps before you can submit your application. So the first step was that you need to add a liaison officers to your application. So as Peter mentioned earlier, the liaison officer is basically the appointed contact person. So we usually have a liaison officer at the emerging center and another one at the supporting center. And so here is where you can add them. So you need to add first name, last name, email address. And then once they are added to your application file, those people will also be able to edit the application form and also contribute to the different steps. So the next, so you see the first task was to add a liaison officer, which we've just done. Then the next thing is to complete the application form. And to complete the application form, it's quite a long form, but basically it includes all sorts of details about the emerging centers and supporting center, and it would also be about the mentoring center if you apply in the context of a trio. And then you have to provide some details about what is it that you're trying to achieve, what are your long-term objectives, and how you're going to do. And we also ask for motivations. So that is for the application form. And then once you've done that, you need to go on to the next steps. And the next step is to complete an activity and a budget planning for the next 2 years. So these are 2 different forms. And here you have to detail what are going to be the different activities that you're going to organize on your through your partnership with the sister organization. So that can be different visits from emerging center to supporting center or vice versa. It can be different projects, and for each item that you list, you have to provide an estimated budget. And once you've done all these steps, you can actually press the green button, which would be submit your application. Once you do that, you will receive an automated email from the system to acknowledge receipt of your application. And once the application is submitted in the system, the program coordinator in the ISN office would receive the notification. We would check internally whether it's all good to be sent to the committee for review. And all applications are sent to the committee members in the course of October for review. If we have any question, if there's anything missing or if there's anything that is not complete, then we would get back to you and ask to provide more details. So yeah, so this was actually very short, but the idea was just to provide you with an idea on how the forms were looking like and what were the different steps to apply. And this is it.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie. It is time now for questions and answers. Again, please type your questions in a question box and we will try to address them. I have already here a question from Zunman Gimba. Not sure if I'm pronouncing it well, sorry. Will pursuing a master's degree in renal transplantation be an example of educational opportunities in the SRC STC initiative? Not sure if you can address this.
I think
here,
probably.
Philip?
Yeah, I would think probably not. That's probably a fairly major undertaking in itself, and I mean, it depends on what the cost is for that sort of thing. I think, and it would depend on where that master's degree was going to be undertaken. But I mean, my knee-jerk response is probably not. We could look at it in more detail, but I wouldn't be overly optimistic of being able to support something like that. I don't know, Phil, whether you have any alternative views?
No, I agree, Peter. I think one of the things to think of as a general principle is how can we use the funds that we're receiving to benefit the broadest number of people within the centre. So something that can support a multidisciplinary team in education, you know, from nursing, allied health, pharmacy, as well as doctors, that is something that, at least in the Transplant Centre program, is viewed more favourably than where the benefit is focused on an individual, even if that's a pretty crucial individual. So they're general principles that would give you a higher priority over other applications. And as Peter's pointed out, it's becoming an increasingly competitive process.
Yep, nicely expressed. Thank you. That was, I think that way of saying, not the focus on the individual and the others, I think is very nicely put.
Okay, thank you. We haven't mentioned before, and we have already some questions regarding that. Yes, this presentation is being recorded, so it will be available for everyone to access later on. So again, feel free to ask your questions. If you wish, you can also click on raise hand button, and because we are in a calm environment, we can try and give you, we can try and unmute you so that you can address directly your questions to our panelists.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that for people who listen to this later on, or even people listening now, if they have questions later, they can always send them through the ISN, either to Sophie or Mara, or I'm quite happy for people to email me with questions.
Likewise, Peter.
Yep.
Okay, we have. Oh, sorry.
Go on.
Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Philip.
I was just saying, if there weren't any questions, I was just going to emphasise things that from the ones we see on the transplant side that would increase the likelihood of success. And I think one of those is, when you're preparing your application, to really focus on what are the needs of the emerging centre, and how, if we overcome some of these, this would improve your capacity. So it's really about capacity building on the emerging centre side. So in transplantation, as well as within developing nephrology expertise in transplantation, there's surgical expertise, there's the pathology, and importantly, there's tissue typing. And there's also issues around live donors and deceased donors and care for those, and how you set up those programs. So if one of the blocks to success is, access to that, or lack of capacity in that, if you, within your application, say you want to focus on that, and you've developed a relationship that can address that need, then I think that would rate highly. The other thing is, it's not essential, but if you've got evidence that you've been collaborating, the two centres have been collaborating for a time prior to the application, and therefore there's some maturity and this is going to value add, that I think is viewed favourably. It doesn't mean if it's a new development that you shouldn't apply. It's just those things, little things that can help your application. So as I said, affecting or benefiting a broad number of people in the emerging centre, addressing specific needs, evidence of collaboration, they're the things that can really help the application.
No more questions, Mara?
Okay, we have a raised hand from Alshima. Alshima, you are now unmuted, I think. I'm trying to unmute you, but I can't. Oh, I suppose Alshima is self-muted, so I cannot unmute Alshima. Okay. Yes, go ahead, Alshima. You have a question?
Yeah. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, perfectly now. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you for this perfect presentation at first, and I'm very sorry that I've joined you lately at the end of the presentation. But I don't know if you talk about the aspect that can I use part of the fund to support any of infrastructure to my units? I mean that in Egypt I want to introduce a peritoneal dialysis service, and actually the dialysate is highly expensive, so this service is not adequately presented in Egypt. Can I use some of the fund to cover the expenses of something like that, or it's just for education purposes only? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly consider it for education purposes, and yeah, unfortunately, there is a slide sort of saying that we don't support capital costs and consumables. Yeah, I suppose it really depends on the exact circumstances. You know, it may be that in establishing a program, there may be, say, an initial supply of say, PD fluid, but it wouldn't be a very big supply, and there'd need to be a plan for ongoing supply. Generally speaking, the answer is we don't like to be in a position of providing consumables, and certainly we're not in a position for any ongoing supply.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Alshima. We're waiting here for, if you have any more questions, just take advantage now. We've got the experts here available for you. In the meantime, I'm not sure if Peter, Philip, or Sophie would like to add any specific tips, any extra information at this point.
I just would like to sorry, Peter.
Yeah. No, you go, Sophie.
I just wanted to reinforce what you just said about asking us any question. So there are these two email addresses that you can join us through. It's src@disn.org or stc@disn.org, whether your question relates to the Sister Renal Center or to the Sister Transplant Center, and we're always very happy to help. So really never hesitate and feel free to get in touch with us.
Yep, absolutely. So,
okay. Yeah. Yes, Peter.
I was just going to say, if people aren't particularly keen to ask questions now, we'll just reinforce that we're available and happy to answer them at a later date, and we can call it a day or a night.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So if you don't have any more questions, I would close the webinar. Thank you, Peter, Philip, and Sophie, of course, for your time. And also thank you for all of the people that attended. As a reminder, again, this session has been recorded, so you'll be able to access the recording and even share it with your colleagues. Again, don't hesitate to contact any of us with any questions that you have about the programs. And then I hope to see you next time and to receive many applications as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Sophie and Mara, and thanks, Phil, for joining.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Sophie and Mara, for organising it. I think well done.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Okay.